Hello everyone, it's David again. I am commenting on Babylon 5, Season 2, Episode 15. And now for a word which originally aired on 3 May 1995. Starts off with an ISN exclusive, September 16th, 2259, 36 hours on Babylon 5 with Cynthia Torqueman. Now this episode has a little bit of CGI and it has a little bit of a space battle at the end. So if you love space battles and CGI and all of that good stuff, this episode has it. Not a whole heck of a lot of it, as we'll come up with later, or as we'll see later, but it does have a little bit just to kind of whet your appetite for future CGI wars. Cynthia Torqueman is giving her little introductory speech to her 36 Hours on Babylon 5 report. She mentions some interesting facts in the B5 universe. It's been 100 years since humanity went to the stars. They have outposts and colonies on 24 worlds in 14 solar systems. Babylon 5 was built near Epsilon Eridani, Eridani. It is a star in the southern constellation of Eridanus, and it can be seen with the unaided eye. I mean the star, not any of the planets, because you'd have to have one hell of a good eyesight to be able to see a planet from Earth. But yes, you can be seen there. Some of the planets in the Eridanus system, they're kind of doing, SETI and NASA have been since I believe the 60s looking for life on some of these planets. And it does appear there to be some preliminary evidence that maybe some of these planets are habitable. So, anyway, and so if you want to, you can go ahead and look up the actual star system that we're talking about. The ISN crew on board their ship, the Heyerdahl. Most of you remember Thor Heyerdahl from school. Heyerdahl. He's the guy who built the Kon-Tiki, and he sailed the majority of the Pacific Ocean, a vast, huge portion of it, lending strong evidence to the theory that ancient Polynesians could have traversed the Pacific Ocean and spread, culture and stuff throughout the northern and southern hemispheres. Because having been born and raised in Alaska, we know that some of the Aleuts on the Aleutian Islands of Alaska, they found their ships as far down south as Tierra del Fuego. So, we've always known it kind of been possible. Thor Heyerdahl kind of led very strong evidence to indicate that it is possible. So, the ISN crew witnessed a Narn ship attack a Centauri transport. And then we cue the entrance. We have, starring Kim Zimmer, plays Cynthia Torqueman. She's born to February 55. She's born in Grand Rapids, Michigan. She's noted mostly for her time on the television series MacGyver, the old one from the 1980s. We have Christopher Curry as Senator Ronald Quantrell, 22 October 1948. He's also from Grand Rapids, Michigan. So I'm wondering if he and Kim Zimmer know each other or knew each other from pre-Babylon 5 days. We have Granville Ames as the Psychop. He plays that Psychop in the commercial with Little Johnny. And I did not get very much info on him. So if you have any information on Mr. Ames, go ahead and pop it down below in the comment section. We have John Christian Grass, Graas, as Johnny. He plays Little Johnny, the little blonde-haired kid who says that he knew a kid was lying, and the kid beat him up until he said he was lying, and blah, blah, blah. The Psychop pops up behind him, and then 2 weeks later we see little Johnny looking really sharp in his new Psychop uniform. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Leslie Wing as his mother. Didn't get much information on her as well. She might have been like a writer or something, because as I've said previously, J. Michael Straczynski likes to take like some of the writers and the executives and people you wouldn't normally see and give them a bit part in his shows. So you'll see a lot of that, where you don't get much information because this person's not really an actor. They're just, a writer or a producer or somebody you wouldn't normally see in front of a camera. So IMDb might not have much info on this person's. Back to Babylon 5. It starts off with an interview of Centauri ambassador and then Jakar in the hallway. She goes and interviews the dock worker and Lieutenant David Corwin. And if you ever noticed, it's been commented on quite a bit, Ivanova is watching like a big mother hen right over his shoulders. And you just know this poor kid is pooping in his pants kind of a thing if he says something wrong. Here's his commanding officer right over his shoulder who's overhearing literally everything. She also does an interview with Captain Sheridan. In 2257, we learn that Lloyd's of London gave 500 to 1 odds against Babylon 5. Las Vegas was 350 to 1. And New Vegas was 200 to 1 against. Now, New Vegas, I can't remember if that was an Earth city. Vegas had to be rebuilt after the nuking of San Diego, or I also want to say it's on one of the colony worlds, or maybe on Mars colony. But anyway, in 2259, Lloyd's of London goes from 500 to 1 down to 250 to 1. And Las Vegas, 350 to 1 down to 201, and New Vegas 200 to 1 down to 5 to 1 against. So it shows you people in New Vegas are pretty conservative bettors, I guess. With Dr. Franklin, she interviews him, talks about someone hiding in an airlock, and he triggered a system, and there was no fail-safes at the time, so the airlock, they were playing hide and seek, and the kid got in an airlock and hit the wrong button and ended up getting sucked out into space. And he says you don't die instantly in a vacuum. Now, having been a registered nurse, I'm going to say this over and over again, I used to work on a telemetry ventilator unit for about 12 years. I've seen people die from respiratory viruses. That's why the COVID virus has been really kind of like, just shaking in my boots. People think that when you die, you just kind of roll your eyes on the back of your head and everybody's boo-hooing and you just go quietly and peacefully. I can assure you that less than 10% of all deaths are like that. Especially with a respiratory virus and you've got mucus and phlegm and you're literally drowning on your own secretions. Okay? I'm not going to get into too much detail because if you've had lunch, I don't want you to deposit your lunch on the floor. But when people tend to take the coronavirus nonchalantly, it's nothing, it's not that big of a deal, and it's like, really? Have you been there when somebody's died of a respiratory virus? Or how about 2 somebodies, or 10 somebodies, or 100 somebodies? I wish a lot of these people could do volunteer time in either an emergency room or a critical care unit for at least 10 years and get a real view of what medicine is really like, because it is not what it's like in the movies. To kind of drive that home, one of the nurses I used to work with brought her son in for kids at work day, and so he was following us around, and lo and behold, one of our patients went into full-blown cardiac arrest. He was coming back from the bathroom and passed out on the floor. And that's one of those few times where we actually had to use the shocker paddles, and we were doing, and I sat, and he's sitting outside, and his eyes were as big as saucers, like, they are not going to believe this at school when I go to school tomorrow. And I'm looking at him, I'm like, it's kind of scary, is it? And he looked at me and he's like, yeah, this is not at all how the movies portray it. He said, this is completely different from what I thought it was going to be. So, my, PSA for this one is get your damn vaccine, okay? Please. We learned that Babylon 5 has had 50 deaths by violence since inception. Jakar comes out with a statement. Centauri ships were carrying weapons for use against their war effort. And he ends up with a veiled threat against Babylon 5 itself. Now, if you compare the Narn and Centauri statements, you see Londo is one who is very much in control of the situation. He's in control of his manners, and you can tell he really understands Earth culture because he's saying all the right things. He's putting out all the right things to try and get the Earth Alliance, at least morally, if not, in fact, on the side of the Centauri. And if you look at the Narn statement, Jakar surrounded by his people, they're all in very stern looking. You see, and you'll find out a little bit later why the Narns are not in control of the situation, that it's rapidly getting out of their control. We also learned that there's been a newly formed Office of Public Morale, and that should always, things like that always get my hackles up, because that, to me, just says, ooh, yeah, we're going to come into some authoritarianism here. When the first thing they start to do is go after the press, and start calling them things like fake news and encouraging their followers to violence, that sort of thing crosses to me the red line of we're jumping the line into authoritarianism. Because if you look at things like Venezuela and other countries, and Hungary and stuff like that, that are starting down that ever slippery slope to authoritarianism, that's how they all started out, was by attacks on, and not just verbal attacks, I mean physical attacks on people in the press. She goes to an interview with Senator Cantrell, and in an interview with Captain Sheridan, he said, it talks about, because we all know Sheridan did his part during the war, as he points out, and he's referring to Senator Quantrell's little statement, we could have won the war if only they would have done the fighting. We kind of see a little bit of that here going on in the U.S. right now, according to the Afghan war that we just concluded. But I think a lot of people were just done here with so we were all just relieved, and it's one of those, as long as it's on that part of the world, we don't really care about. The problem is we found out on September the 11th, there really is no other side of the planet. No matter what problems are going to brew, they're eventually going to brew in your backyard, and eventually you will have to come out and deal with them. So what that means for Afghanistan, I have no idea. No, if anyone here has been to Afghanistan, go ahead and write down below what you think is going to happen there. I'd be really interested to, guess I should call my nephew Howard, since he did time there. Because I contacted my oldest nephew and his mother, my second oldest sister, and I talked about the differences between Afghanistan and Iraq, and quite interesting, but that is an argument for a different channel. We go through and she interviews Ivanova and Michael Garibaldi. She attempts to interview Kosh, and in her attempt to get Kosh's interview, we find out that Kosh has a last name. It is Kosh Naranik of the Vorlon Empire. Now, who is the emperor and empress? Do the because after all, they're all Kosh, so do they even have genders at this point in time? We learned that Earth sent out 3 expeditions and they all had never returned. So what happened? Were they all destroyed, or were they just taken on board and put to good use and never heard from again? As we've known, the old Soviet Union, I guess, used to do with some of the Vietnam and Korean captures. They would take them and put them to work in Siberia. During her interview with Delenn, we find out that Mimbar is the 7th planet from their sun. The top quarter of Mimbar is a polar ice cap, and many cities are cut directly from crystalline deposits. They have 3 main languages, and they compared her to her arrival photo, and kind of got into making Delenn cry, because they're like, look, we learned that 250,000 humans were killed during the Earth-Minbari War, and Cynthia Torqueman was coming off in her questioning, like, what right do you have to come in and appropriate our culture, and without even asking us if we wanted to have our culture appropriated? That you're kind of violating the memory of the humans that perished during the Earth-Minbar War. And we see Delenn get really emotional, asking the interview to end, and here she is, and she's getting buzzed because they're going to Advisory Council and the League are going to be convened for an update to the Narns Centauri situation. So, we zip on in to the Advisory Council, and we do learn that the Centauri were carrying weapons. But does this matter with the B5 treaty? Because they are allowed to conduct weapon sales, but all transfers must be conducted off ship. So I don't see the problem with it. Did they have to be further out, or for safety reasons, or what? But of course, the Narns aren't going to let this one drop. We also learn that there are 7 more Centauri ships berthed outside, and of course, Jakar wants them all brought in, interrogated, and searched. And of course, Londo is saying, hey, you're violating our sovereign rights and the Babylon 5 treaty. We can do whatever the hell we want to outside a Babylon 5 jurisdiction. So I guess the $64,000 question is where exactly does Babylon 5 jurisdiction begin, and where does it end? Anyway, all of a sudden, the power drain, and Sheridan's like, what's going on? And Ivanova comes over, and she says, Captain, you got to get up here. There's a war going on. And this is the part where the CGI comes in. The Centauri and Narn transports are shooting at each other, and Delta Squadron's out there, and they're also now starting to get targeted. So Sheridan eventually gives them the okay to open fire. Eventually, the Narn and Centauri, the remainder of them, surrender, and they're taken on board for questioning. As this was going on, Cynthia Torqueman brought up an earlier interview that she did with Jakar and the Centauri, Londo, and we learned that 150 years ago, the Centauri went to Narn, which was green and fertile. So is this a setup for the Shadow Wars? Because we know in the the Valen Shadow War, the shadows struck too quickly. They came out of hiding too quickly. So it was the original Narn Centauri War, was that kind of in preparatory for the 1,000-year Shadow War? I'm wondering, it sounds like that's kind of what they're implying. And there was a 100-year war to freedom. We all know that the Centauri mistress of a house, Jakar's dad, had spilt some hot jala on her, and she had him hung out by, I think it's a Jawa tree, for 3 days until he died. And he said there are certain humans for the phrase never again has special meaning. And we also learn, very crucially, that the Narn have lost 6 out of the last 7 battles with the Centauri. So, we now know why the Narns earlier were looking a little bit stern, anxious, nervous, whatever you want to call it. It's because they're getting their butts kicked. And it's consisting now of holding actions. So that to me says that they're just preparing for the inevitable Centauri breakthrough, which of course we all know happens with shadow assistance. From Londo's view, he says the Centauri gave Narns tech centuries ahead of their own, taught them languages and culture, and they repaid them with terror and death. And after considerable money being spent, they finally, to civilize the Narns, they finally had had enough and just left. According to the Centauri version. They weren't driven off, they just kind of said, oh, well, we weren't going to force the issue, so long, love you, bye-bye. But he also brings up the crucial thing, they were the ones to declare war, not us. So once you declare war, does that now mean anything goes? Or, because there are certain rights, I guess, that you have from a formal declaration of war. And that's also why we haven't seen many declarations of war since 1945, the early 1945s, to any large scale, I should say. There is some concern, right? What had happened right before this time? Like, did Panama declare war against the United States? Did Noriega declare war? Or was that just bad Spanglish? And he said we're in a state of conflict. Not necessarily a full-on declaration of war, but, Bush Sr. took it, ran with it, and said they declared war on us, so therefore we can go in and put, Mr. Noriega in handcuffs and hope he doesn't tell everybody about all the drugs we did with him. Drug deals we did with him, I should say. We, all of a sudden, beep beep, the alarms go off and a Centauri battle cruiser nearly jumps into Babylon 5 and enacts a blockade. We're not going to allow our ships to be searched, and if you try any funny business, we're here to enforce the peace, basically, I guess. This is where we zip to the commercial with Johnny and the Psy Cop. As most of you may remember, towards the end of this commercial, there is a subliminal message that is printed up there. I believe it was like trust the core or something like that. It refers a little bit to during the 1980s. Most of you, like me, who grew up during the 80s, there was this group of conservative Christian fundamentalists who wanted all heavy metal banned in the United States because they were convinced that if you turned these records and played them backwards, that there were satanic messages in them. Well, you can't really do that, but yeah, okay, whatever. And of course, there's been many testing done by universities and all kinds of groups. There are no messages when you play these things in reverse, but who stops the facts from getting away of fiction? It kind of reminds me a little bit of that. The little flash of the screen about, oh, hey, we're giving you a subliminal message, It kind of reminds me back during that, and also eventually I think led to the parental advisory little stamps on, records and CDs and all kinds of other things. The Babylon 5 ends up running, takes the automatic transport and ends up running the Centauri blockade. However, as they were going to try and negotiate a solution to this, a Narn cruiser jumps in and starts a major battle with the Centauri. I shouldn't say a major battle, but it was a one-on-one ship. However, they end up destroying the Centauri ship. However, their own jump engines were damaged to the point when they tried to jump away, which I'm not sure why you would do that necessarily, because, I'd wait at least for an hour or two and get instructions from somebody, but they tried to jump away with a damaged engine and ended up destroying themselves in the process. So, as we're going through and concluding the interviews for the ISN network, Delenn made some, and I'm going to, I wrote this down. Humans share one unique ability. They build communities. But wherever humans go, they build communities out of sometimes diverse and sometimes hostile populations. It is a great gift and terrible responsibility. And you're going to learn that in the Babylon 5 universe, this is kind of what their ethos is surrounding. Their whole MO is, to show that humans can build communities, sometimes diverse and hostile people. If you remember the Yugoslav wars, which were hot in during this time, you had Serbs and Croats and Muslims and Christians, and all of them had built communities together. Sarajevo was built out of a multi-ethnic community. Sadly, in the case of Yugoslavia, it was literally torn apart in a vicious civil war. Sort of like what the Minbari will later go through. They just kind of papered over their differences until the situation arose where they could no longer paper over their differences. And sadly, massive violence is what resulted, at least in the case of Yugoslavia. A little bit so much later we'll find out also for the Minbari. But Sheridan makes a little quote. He said, "The job of B5 is to create the peace, not enforce the peace." I guess that comes up later when you become president, Sheridan. So anyways, little bit of some CGI and battles to digest. What do you guys think of little Johnny and his commercial? You think he's being prepared for a life of government service? Do you think the Narns were justified, or the Centauri were justified in their transport of weapons off Babylon 5? Or do you think the Narns were justified in their response of look, we don't care where it comes from. If you're supplying weapons to our enemies, we're going to come after you no matter where or when or what have you. Kind of like, maybe a contemporary might be Israel and Iran. If Iran wants to make a nuclear weapon, Israel's going to go after them, was it hook, tooth, and nail until Iran stops trying to go after nuclear weapons. Is that a good contemporary analogy or a really bad one? Comments down below. As always, like, comment, subscribe, and please share. We are at 97 subscribers, so we are this close to getting 100 subs. I'm taping this the day after Thanksgiving, American Thanksgiving, I should say. So I hope you all had a wonderful Thanksgiving holiday and preparatory time for Christmas, if that's your religion or whatever. I think about 12 different religions have their holiday season coming up, or we're in the middle of it. So anyways, hope you all have a good holiday season.